All right, welcome back to another side quest talking about Final Fantasy VIII. Back with me is my perennial companion, Mr. Wes Schantz. Good to see you, Wes, and
Yeah.
good to see that you're getting over the cold that you had earlier in the week, or whatever.
Yes. Whatever it was, it seems to have worked itself out for the moment, but we'll see what comes next. Well,
Well, I appreciate you making the time to be here, and I'm sure that the listeners, both present and future, appreciate this too. And well, so I just kind of wanted to jump in today with talking about the fact that before the show you were mentioning that you were no longer watching Final Fantasy VIII videos, but that you had started play, that you had gotten through the SeeD test, gotten your first SeeD ranking, which I think is higher than mine. It's either the same or higher. I need to check it. This can be checked. But I when I first saw it, I was like, I think that's higher than mine. And also you were saying, and this really delighted me, that you were enjoying the game. And this is not a game that was one of your favorites, if I
mm,
recall. I know that you're a big fan of Earthbound, like Earthbound, Chrono Trigger, and Xenogears in
hmm
particular. I think probably many more too, but those are ones that I associate particularly with you. And I think you've done a podcast series on every single one of those at this point too.
Well, our series on Chrono Trigger is one episode long right now, but it's
That's
in the
right.
making. It's
No,
still
that's
it's still
right.
cooking.
Okay, yeah, well, there's all sorts of temporal issues and questions with Fred.
Right,
I must have been thinking about the future and the past, right?
right.
But could you just tell the listeners a little bit about what you're enjoying this time
Okay.
around playing? And if you could too, could you speak to the difference, if there is a difference, between playing, having manual control, being the Squall to Laguna, as it were, versus watching?
Well, yeah. I wasn't actually watching any. I was talking about like I probably will end up watching some of this game if I don't get into it, but I don't think I'll do that now. Yeah, I think I'll stick with it at least for now. It looks like it's kind of got its claws into me, and so the reason that I was doing that, was talking about doing that is because my main reason for playing it or thinking about it right now is to be able to talk about it and study it in the context of RPGs as a genre, and particularly in the time period, the era of sort of that transition from the Super Nintendo to the PlayStation, um, looking at games like Earthbound, Chrono Trigger on Super Nintendo, and then looking at the Final Fantasy VII, 8, and so on, in the next generation, and seeing how they are different. Like right now, I'm looking at Super Mario RPG pretty closely, because I played some of the re-releases of different games in the Paper Mario series, and so I'm kind of curious about that as a kind of turning point in the genre, and the way that it has influenced other, uh, you know, things within console video games. And so Final Fantasy VIII is fun right now because I have finally started to understand how to work within its systems and kind of appreciate it for what it is, and just kind of get over the fact that it is not my favorite game, and finding that it's still worth uh, looking at how the team that made it is taking ideas that were there before and really kind of subverting them in some cases, right? Things that you expect are not very helpful, and things that you don't expect turn out to be very helpful. I'm talking specifically about the card game here, and I know you mentioned that you lost your one good card, so that's a bummer. But it's not too late. Your early game, you can still get back into it. I'm telling you, man, the card game is crucial. It's addicting. It's very simple and soothing. It can be very frustrating, I guess, if you lose, but you basically can't lose once you start to win a little bit. It's one of those deals where to those that have, more shall be given, and those that have not, everything will be taken away. It's one of those kind of things. So I'm just in the stage of the game where you basically are just you know, a newbie. You're low level. You're nothing in the scheme of things. And yet, by playing the card game, by playing your cards right, as it were, you can get some crazy items and spells. You can start refining things. You plug the cards into the Guardian Forces and those different abilities, and the ways that those systems start to work together is wild. It makes the game basically trivial for as long as you want it to be. I think if you can junction magic to your health and it just like triples your HP, I mean, uh, yeah, what are we doing here? It's just kind of silly. So that might be part of why if I did get a better ranking, it's because I'm cheating. You know, I'm reading about stuff. I haven't been watching videos, but I have been reading someone's Let's Play, you know, to be able to look back at specific dialogue. So the Let's Plays are really helpful when you're studying these games. Um, and I have been using the walkthroughs to make sure that I'm not missing stuff that is like missable, you know, because like lots of things in the game, if you don't see them, it doesn't really matter. You can go back later and see them or whatever. They don't impact much. But I want to try to see, you know, all of the stuff that's there and all of the text from different people that if you talk to them at different times is going to change, right? That's missable. And then a lot of this card game stuff. If you don't do it early, it becomes difficult or impossible to go back and do it later. So it's just doing that and thinking about that has been pretty fun this time. And yeah, I feel really lucky to have been able to set aside enough time to actually get into it. So we'll see if that continues to be possible, but I'm hopeful. Yeah.
Well, I think that's fantastic. And who wouldn't want a teacher who was enthusiastic about his subject? And insofar as you are, you are one of our instructors here. But I want to talk about that just a little bit more because, right, so the card game, and I want to talk about a couple of the strange features of Final Fantasy VIII and how that may have paved the way for systems like Final Fantasy X and the sphere system,
Oh
where
yeah, yeah.
one can end up mastering basically everything, similar to Elder Scrolls Morrowind, where one can sort of become the head of every guild and a royal family and be like just as powerful a mage as a warrior. And so choices that one has to make and say like a Dungeons and Dragons game are not there. But that is something interesting about the card game, right? And jokes. I'm a member of a Facebook Final Fantasy VIII sort of jokes page, and like something that's frequently done is that memes are posted, and then there's a dialogue box added, and it's want to play cards. So it's like Jaws is coming up to eat somebody, and there's a dialogue box, want to play cards.
Let's
And so
play.
that's like one of the strange features of Final Fantasy VIII that I want to put out as like a hypothesis 3, like not a very strong hypothesis, but one that I think is possible, but may not probably doesn't survive Occam's razor, is
Okay.
that one reason people dislike this game, besides the fact that the character models are now bigger, even in the external world, they're no longer using the sprites. And this was a huge jump, even from Final Fantasy VII, which still had sprites in the overworld, right?
Yeah.
And there were cinematic sequences where people were full size, but often they were these cute little things. So besides that, and besides sort of the more scientific theme, and maybe, and these are the other reasons people traditionally don't like the game as much, the like kind of overdone love story, and we'll have to determine whether we think it's overdone, is because of these system constraints and system quirks of the game that seemed weird and possibly irrelevant, but were of supreme importance for playing the game well, and in fact were necessary for, like you said, for starting to master early in the game, lest one be so underpowered in the late game that one can't progress forward. For example, something that the game does to punish one for playing unintelligently is that if one over levels in the traditionalist sort of RPG way, the bosses, or excuse me, the bosses and the characters or the regular random battles level with you, while also becoming proportionally more powerful. So that if you don't know how to raise your GFs right, if you don't know how to junction to yourself certain abilities that increase your strength or your magic or your ability to increase the power boost of your GFs, and just try and linearly progress. Again, like you said, to those who have, they will be given. To those who don't have, they're going to lose out. To people who don't understand that mastering the mechanics of the system is essential, not extra,
Yeah.
they find themselves in bad places near the end of the game. To that point, cards seems like a random, weird side game that you can play with a surprising number of people in Final Fantasy VIII that you wouldn't necessarily expect. It turns out that even major characters at points will play cards with you, and you have to try and win their special card, which then you can later try and refine into some item that might be part of making your ultimate weapon. So that's a different thing about this game too, right? You don't just find your ultimate weapon. You can't just beat some boss, some very difficult boss, albeit, to get your weapon. You have to get these rare items and then go through this process of refining, or whatever it's called in Final Fantasy VIII. It has some specific name. It may be that. And that is the way that you really have to quest quite a bit, and you would never figure out these proportions without a strategy guide too. But so all of that goes to say is that this strange side quest that seems irrelevant, that's kind of weird, that you might not even like at first, which is certainly very, very frustrating, especially as the rules change with the card queen who lives right near where you are in the same city that Zeldinkt is from. Right. Unless you have some sort of, and this is maybe part of the problem and the beauty of such a game, and perhaps why one needs a strategy guide / a big brother / somebody who's played through it before, is that how could you possibly know the importance of the card game right when you first play it, or the draw system, or the fact that when you level up your GFs, you need to not let them just auto choose what they're going to randomly choose, because their AI is not sophisticated enough to choose what's most interesting to you. But if you don't learn to do that, you end up in a bad spot. But if you do, you can break the game, right?
Oh, yeah.
Some people have the Squall's ultimate weapon by the end of the first of 4 discs, and can potentially be so powerful that the vast majority of bosses they can either one hit or take out much quicker than they were intended. And so in some ways, and this is way overstating it, I think some people have the same problem with Final Fantasy VIII as they have with capitalism. There are people that lose out just doing what seems like the right thing to do, maybe working a job. And then there are people that can break the system, like Bankman-Fried's, and who understand exponential functions and dividends, and can exploit that, to use the language of the times, in order to enrich themselves, because they understand the mechanisms of the system. So, okay, that's my hypothesis 3, Wes, that because it is a sophisticated, interesting system, but you have to be interested in systems. So even though it's such a beautiful RPG at the time, it was the most state of the art, right? It was also intricate, and you had to be sort of a nerd to actually, I mean, you're already a nerd if you like Final Fantasies, right? You like stories, you're willing to play a game that's basically math with some art based around it, at least when it comes to fights and percentages and things like that, and making the judgments necessary to win. But right, like if you just want to ignore that element and have a good game, Final Fantasy VIII is not a good game for you. It reminds me of elements of Chrono Cross and Chrono Trigger, where you really need to know the elemental types of the creatures that you're fighting against, and that makes the fights really easy. But if, again, you just like button smash and try and kill them, you might get smoked all of a sudden. And so you have to pay attention. You can't just move through thoughtlessly, and you have to make intelligent decisions, and some intelligent decisions without it would be very difficult to have the foresight, especially as like a 12 to 15-year-old, to know to play this person in cards and get this card from them and then refine it into this item, or to like junction strength to this person, or magic. It seems like one would really have to actually study up on the game some in order to play it right. And and that I think is part of what people did not like about it, or do not like about it.
It's tricky. There's a balance there, right? Because if you're too into the systems, I think it can be, it can basically paralyze you, because it's like trying to optimize it. You can go so far with it so early that you could spend hours and hours trying to get exactly the right cards that you need to turn them into the exact right items to refine into the exact right, like either weapons or magic or whatever. And so there's a kind of paralysis that would set in there that I could see being very frustrating for someone who cared a lot about that stuff. And on the other hand, I think it is possible to probably do decently well at this game. I agree, like maybe there's certain things towards the end game that become very hard, if not impossible, without understanding some amount of this system. But the game does take some pains to like walk you through the basics in a series of tutorials here, right? Like you are literally a student and your teacher is like pausing every so often to explain like this or that component of a much larger interlocking set of systems, right? And she doesn't explain everything, and she kind of glosses over some things or leaves some things out. Um, but yeah, but I think you get kind of the basics. And it's interesting what you say about the GFs sort of choosing or defaulting to abilities that are not that good, right, in the long run. That I distinctly remember, like, oh, like this must be the thing to learn first. So I'll let my GF learn this first. When I first played this game, I was all about like summoning GFs, trying to make them as powerful as possible. And I was like, oh, that must be like how and it's not at all, it's not at all an effective strategy. Um, the GF will default to like boosting its own summon power and all that stuff. Whereas what you really want is those junction pieces, right? It's the pieces where the character interlocks with the GF and you can connect magic to that. And so it's the places where the systems overlap that they sort of multiply their effect and become like really effective and powerful. And those are the things that are not very well explained and that are sort of like left to the player to figure out slash to hear from someone, online or who knows the game better, right? So there's a really interesting way in which the systems, as they're explained within the game, remain sort of superficial. And it's like kind of funny how like little curiosity the characters show about all this stuff, right? Like nothing makes sense. Like why should a card be able to be turned into a spell, or why should a GF have its own card when you like beat it? You beat Ifrit, you get its card for some reason. Like why? But but then the element of like outside of the game, thinking about the game or reading about the game or talking about it with people, that's where you start to piece it all together in ways that make progress a lot smoother for you. So I find that pretty funny and
I
fun to
mean,
think
that's
about. Yeah.
interesting because that is the junction system and how that adds to the combat. It is in fact very deeply tied to the very interesting mythology underlying Final Fantasy VIII too.
Right.
One does not natively have magic. There's a big difference between this Final Fantasy and several others. There's this materia system in Final Fantasy VII. In Final Fantasy VI, there's these strange Vespers. They can use some magic. Final Fantasy V, I believe you have the class system.
Hmm.
But here, not only do people not naturally have magic, in order to get magic, they have to draw it from a draw point or from
Yes.
someone else. But even before that, they have to junction a GF.
Hmm.
So you have to have a GF junction to you. This is strange. And this reminds me a little bit of what's going on in Final Fantasy XVI, where you have these dominants of the GFs, which is itself very similar to the idea from Attack on Titan of the people who have the Titan form. They're like, what, 8 or 10 of these people, and they have these godlike Titan powers. That's basically what's going on in Final Fantasy XVI. In fact, Titan is one of the GFs. They're called icons again. And
Yes.
yeah, though they should be called Acons, but a little bit more German than Greek pronunciation from our voice actors in Final Fantasy 16. But we'll forgive them that. I doubt they're classicists.
It's fine.
So these people who can summon the GFs of Final Fantasy 16 are extraordinarily exceptional people. And I think there is an ethical question that comes up in this Final Fantasy about the use of GFs. In fact, that's mentioned to us at our graduation by the garden faculty, right? Don't listen to anyone if they mention you using GFs. I think that's
Right.
him that mentions that. There is an authority figure that makes a comment to that effect at the point in the game that we're in, where there's something a little bit strange about junctioning a guardian force to you that then allows you to draw magic, use magic, and you don't just have magic. So you have a certain number of magics, like items. So magic works like items.
Exactly.
And like what you said, the magic, if you have junction strength and you have a powerful magic and you have 100 of that item, which is the max you can have, you then can junction your 100 pieces of fire magic or fire aggro to your strength. And it will then go from, like, say, a quantity of 10 to like maybe 30. And then that triples your strength all
crazy.
at once. And so that knowing to level one's GF in such a way as to develop that ability and then to draw enough magic to then junction that magic to your strength. And if you know how to find a more powerful magic even earlier in the game, you can add even greater to your strength or to your magic or to your HP, like you said. And these just give you this knowledge gives you huge advantage. And so it's interesting that in some way this is the most pedagogical of games, of Final Fantasies. Like you said, you literally are a student, literally at a training center / school, where part of what the good player will do is actually go back to Squall's desk and read up on the world one is a member of. But in order to actually do that as a player, one has to be a sort of good student as a person and player. One has to value being a good student and investing the time necessary to do what makes one successful in this world. And that really mimics the sort of thing that makes one successful at school, being studious and putting in this necessary prep work. And so it's interesting, myself not having been a great student, ironically, but that I really liked Final Fantasy VIII, and I valued the capability. I was not a big systems freak, and I didn't get overwhelmed by playing by getting into the systems. I liked the game. I liked getting through the game. I liked the love story because I was unattractive and young and lonely. And man, Squall was cool. Gunblade, for God's sake. And
so
cool. But I did appreciate that one could augment oneself in such unique, interesting ways and become vastly more powerful based on just more intelligent utilization of the resources at one's disposal. That's a really liberating and interesting thing about Final Fantasy VIII. Even if you just pay a little bit more attention and work a little bit harder at getting what you want, you can significantly empower yourself in the space. And the game gives you the tools, like you said, to do this sort of thing, and gives you these basic explanations that if you have the wherewithal to pay attention to them and think them through, they will enrich your experience. But there are punishments, and if you don't do these sorts of things, I would say that Final Fantasy VIII was the first Final Fantasy where I felt like I really had to have the strategy guide.
It feels that way to me too. There's just so much stuff to miss. Like even the little like magazines and stuff scattered all around. Like there's literally no way to see them. I can't even tell a lot of times where I can like walk, and where I can't walk. Final Fantasy VII had that a little bit going on, but you could turn on like a little indicator that would like point out for you, like, oh, here's a place you can actually go. In Final Fantasy VIII, it's just like it's all just sort of a very pretty looking, backdrop, and some of it you can interact with, and some of it you can't interact with, and it's really not clear to me which is which. So, like, lost, just lost.
Yes. Okay. Well, that's good to hear too, because Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VIII, and I didn't know about the select button feature of Final Fantasy VII for all too long. And there's one particular Mako reactor that I recall being in this large space, and I just had no idea where to go, because Final Fantasy VII would also have those large areas where you would be very tiny, and it would be hard to know, like, do I need to go down this, this ladder and then walk across here, and where is the exit? Actually, there are a bunch of places that look like exits, but I can only actually move towards so many of them. But that's neither here nor there. The select feature makes that much easier to deal with. But something in the pre-show that I said I thought we should give some thought to, or at least mention, was sort of our dismissal of the games after Final Fantasy VIII, and maybe we didn't dismiss Final Fantasy IX as much because it's still on the PlayStation. Final Fantasy X is maybe in this limbo spot because we haven't really said anything about the PS2 versions. 11 and 14 are online versions, so perhaps there's something extra. But 12, 13, 15, and 16 have all come out and are more traditional style Final Fantasies than the online versions that have come out also among them. And from what I have read, and I'm willing to reconsider this, 12 was going to be quite great, but the story designer or the director, somebody with a major role who was really or I guess there's the scenario designer and the director, he went crazy after developing 10 hours of the game, and so it starts off spectacularly but then really falls off. It goes from like an A+ amazing game, and I have to investigate this myself, to a game that's a little more middle of the pack. 13 seems to be pretty polarizing. Obviously, a lot of people love it. In the language of the young people today, many people are lightning stans. That's our female protagonist. And then there are two additional sequels to the game, Lightning, like Final Fantasy 13 2 and 3, in the style of Final Fantasy 10 2. Then Final Fantasy 15, I've really only seen one comment that stood out to me, that the game is like a boy band going on a road trip.
That's what I've heard too, yeah.
And but then we come to 16. And 16 has made me pause, Wes, for a couple reasons, and you actually gave me additional evidence to pause. So one thing to say about 16 is I have, like I was giving you grief for, been watching some videos of it and some of it for myself. But thinking that my original hypothesis about what I loved about Final Fantasy VII and VIII was that I ingested them while I was in my formative periods. And so regardless, even though they are great games, I thought that the reason they had the effect on me that they did was because I was at an impressionable age. And so Final Fantasy 16 and what I've seen said about it is starting to make me rethink that position. Because I've seen some of the boss battles, and I need to tell you, Wes, people are saying things like, this was the most incredible boss battle I have ever witnessed. Like, this went so hard with the music and the gameplay that I was shaking at the end of it. People are saying things like, I thought Final Fantasy VII, or I thought Final Fantasy VII Remake is where this series ended, and Final Fantasy 16 has totally made me rethink that. And not to mention the fact that it's beautiful, and I think it does what a lot of shows and movies have been trying to do for a long time. It takes a similar theme. Again, I think it's very similar to Attack on Titan, in that there are these extremely gifted individuals who can become these godlike beings, and basically what they want to happen is what's going to happen in the world. And that theme, and so imagine these sorts of people existing within various political arenas, and then they become, mercenary / parts of armies, which is not so different from what we see in Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VIII, and in fact, probably very deep connection to VIII. But all this goes to say is that Final Fantasy 16, the buzz surrounding it and the things people say are so similar to what people were saying about 7 to me, that it has warranted additional consideration for me in a way that I haven't given to a Final Fantasy since Final Fantasy X. I really played 7, 8, 9, and 10, and then sort of went to college and moved on for a time from Final Fantasy. But to this point, and you suggested this, so you've added to this point already in the pre-show, our soon to hopefully friend to the show, of MJ Gallagher, who books on who had written only 2 books on Final Fantasy VII, I believe. Norse mythology and Final Fantasy VII, and then he had a second both Greek mythology and Final
Yeah.
Fantasy VII, which well, I have some criticisms of that, but obviously I wouldn't share that on the show when we're talking to him. But
That's fair.
I would love to talk to him some about myself being partially a classicist. There are
Yeah.
just things that I would add. But he's done, from what I've seen, great work, and I'm glad that he's considering the work from that sort of angle, because I think that in a large part mirrors our own work, which has mostly been audio visual at this point. But once we start writing, I think we're going to have quite a bit. We already have a lot written, and so once we codify it, I think there will be plenty there. So listeners should be excited. But
Yeah.
this book, which you sent me a link to, which is on Kickstarter right now, so I guess he's raising the funding to publish this book. Am I right?
Yeah. I think he's raised way more than he needs. So
Okay.
it's kind of like it's in the either the publication process right now, or he might already be sending them out to people who backed it. Yeah,
Cool.
it looks like they got their goal within 15 minutes, which was a modest goal, £3,000, and it's up closer to 30,000 at the moment.
Wow. So 10 times what he expected.
Yeah,
And
so
of course,
not too bad.
he's moved on from Final Fantasy VII to which Final Fantasy? Final Fantasy
16.
And so, I think part of the pleasure of doing these projects with you, Wes, is figuring out the next step. It's like when you travel, you want to figure out where you're going to travel to, so you have something to look forward to next. So you're not just left with empty space. And so, I was even telling my wife this, who in general looks on video games with derision and
Yeah,
has a
fair.
more traditionalist view of them. I would say a traditionalist wife view of them. I'm not saying that's what all wives think, but like the millennial wife of our generation. So there are of course many non-traditionalists, which is awesome. But I didn't meet one of those. But she was like, "Oh yeah, how would you play that?" I was like, I would have to buy Final Fantasy V, which or excuse me, a PlayStation 5. And you'll see why I mixed that up in a moment. Which I already kind of wanted to buy to get these next two iterations of the Final Fantasy VII trilogy, which apparently everything gets turned into a trilogy these days, even that which is not part of a trilogy, right? Like the original Lord of the Rings was just one book, it's turned into a trilogy, and then even The Hobbit is turned into a trilogy.
Sad days.
Which is the Lord of the Rings has been split in publication, but The Hobbit was only split in movies. Sort of a travesty. And in any case, she's like, "Oh well, Final Fantasy, or excuse me, a PlayStation 5, maybe you should get one of those." And it's like Final Fantasy 16 plus Final Fantasy VII remake makes me tempted to get this sort of thing. Maybe I'll start a Kickstarter for it.
There you go.
But all that goes to say is that I wonder how that would cut against our hypothesis that there was a golden age in video games, and there was something possibly lost between the 1990s Super Nintendo and PlayStation RPGs and this current one, or whether there was something that had been lost that has finally been reintegrated. Because maybe that would be my true hypothesis one. The buzz surrounding this game is all of a sudden people thought Final Fantasy was over, or they thought it had been over for a while, that it had just been on the decline, that it was good, but it hadn't been able to hit its glory since 7. And even 8 was a huge step down from 7 in a way. But now I am not seeing a lot of negativity about 16. And again, people are being blown away. And that's something that I didn't know if a video game could have that power for a 35 to 40-year-old person, or somebody even older. As a medium, I wasn't sure that it could still impact somebody in that sort of way.
Well, the cynical part of me wants to just say, like, well, it definitely can if you're making content on YouTube and you want that content to be like viewed by a lot of people and all that. So that's what I would say first, and I'll wait and see for
this
myself. Yeah.
these are people who comment on these
Yeah,
too.
yeah,
So it's not just the content creators. It's
that's
it's like huge amounts of comments on this too by people being like sick, sick. This is amazing. This is the most amazing battle I've ever had since Emerald Weapon. Like, or
nice.
and so right. Okay, so I counsel you. I would, yeah, no, sure. You should have the cynical view because I've put some eyes on this and it surprised me.
Cool.
And because I didn't think it was possible, and I could still be wrong because I'm just beginning to look into this Final Fantasy 16 phenomenon, but it may very well be a phenomenon, and it may partake of something similar to what Final Fantasy VII did. It may be a generational sort of game, and so if it is, it might be important to look at it in the context of these other games that we have because I don't know. The game designer may have sat everybody down at Square and been like, "This is a Final Fantasy. This is the sort of experience we're looking to give to people," and really and may have succeeded in creating something unique, generational, and great. But that is the optimist position,
Yeah.
not the cynical position. That said, I guess we should get into Final Fantasy VIII itself.
Mhm.
And so you played through basically the first major portion. Could you tell us a little bit about what stood out to you? Maybe the relationship between the cinematics and the dialogue and the gameplay. I'd love for you to mention the music and whether you liked any of that. I mean, the Balam
Oh
Garden
yeah.
music is sets my soul at rest, I would say.
Oh yeah,
Um,
it's good. It's good
and then
stuff. The
and then
also,
also, yeah,
go
go
ahead.
on.
Well, I just to say, I mean, the garden, you're gonna spend a lot of time in the garden, so it's good that the music is soothing and sort of fitting for that. It's a little bit odd, given again that the game starts out so mellow. You know, it doesn't have that kind of like impetus that most of these games have a kind of mission where you're on right away and you figure out a little by little who you are. This game is not that way. And and it allows you to really just kind of explore the world and chill. Uh, and you don't even get your first Guardian forces unless you do be a good student and check the, the computer, right? So that's fascinating to me. It really wants you to slow down. And and to the point where in the timer sections, um, it's again, it's like it's messing with your expectations because you actually have plenty of time in the fire cavern where there's a timer going, and you actually get a higher score towards your exam the less time you have left. So the more that you can figure out exactly how much HP is left for Ifrit, and if you can take him out with only like 30 seconds to go, that's how you like max out that element of the exam. So so that's interesting, right? It is kind of a hidden thing. It doesn't like make that clear to you. Um, the opposite is true for the other part of the exam, though. So when you're actually doing the mission as a SeeD candidate with live fire and all that stuff, you do want to like complete that as quickly as possible, I think. But there's a number of other factors that are going towards your overall score there, and all that stuff does is basically like I guess set the starting point of your pay grade essentially. And so you'll notice that you don't get money from battles. And so it's again kind of a hint that you don't need to like fight a lot of battles per se. You get money just by being in the game long enough, right? At a certain point, you start to get your salary, and it just pays you. And so you you kind of have all of these little like hints from the game, like nudging you to to treat it in a slightly different way than you might have expected, right? Um, and the weirdest part about it so far, for me at least, is that you you are like this kind of elite fighting force, right? Uh, but simultaneously, you are just kids. And some really odd moments kind of like bring that to your attention. It's not like the game is trying to conceal that. It's almost like pointing it out. Just like the way that the characters act, right? They act convincingly like adolescents in a lot of ways. They're very immature. They're very much posing as something that they're not. in a lot of ways, Seifer, right, is really hurt that he is chastised at the end of the exam for doing the Seifer thing, right? And it does sound like he has like failed a number of attempts at this, and he's just kind of repeating it because he has, as he mentions, he has a dream, right? And maybe someday he'll tell us about his romantic dream. Um, but it's so interesting, right? He's not the thug that he's portrayed maybe as being at first. Far from it, you know. He's got some deep feelings, and he's got his little crew of friends, um, and he gives you the slow clap when you come back from getting your results. So I think that Quistis is the other one who really shows that too, right? She's a teacher, but she's also barely older than the students, and she has a lot of kind of um, imposter syndrome around that, right? And she has her crew that like look up to her and idolize her, and yet she also seems to be really craving connection with Squall and really wanting, for whatever reason, to be friends with this very unfriendly person. And he continually rebuffs her, right? He just doesn't want it at all. And so there's some really funny dynamics there where it's like, are you an elite combat, trainer unit person, or are you just like a very insecure young woman? Are you an elite, mean, tough guy wearing a cool trench coat, or are you just like a punk kid who keeps failing at stuff? Right? It's both. It's both. And so I find that really, really amusing and kind of there's a kind of pathos there that totally, went over my head last time. Zell and Selfie, similarly, right? They're just very endearing. They're hilarious. Um, and then we have all of these other kind of peripheral characters who are kind of interesting, right? Squall is like curious about who was that woman, right? That lady that he saw briefly. Maybe she was a hallucination, maybe she's real, but she of course is there after the dance, right? And then there's the whole dance scene itself, and that cinematic is really cool, where it's like at first he's very clumsy, but then it becomes clear like maybe he was just pretending to be clumsy because suddenly he's like able to dance really well, right? It's kind of magical. And so I don't know if we're just like seeing him finally start to thaw there, or he's showing off a little bit for this girl who's, attracted to him at least, maybe, or maybe she's pretending, right? So there's a lot of fun stuff in the slippage between like the ways that the game is presenting itself, both in terms of the gameplay, the mechanics, the visuals, the cinematics, and then the characters as we see them so far. Those are all things that really like leapt out to me this time that I don't think I paid enough attention to the first time around, to be fair.
That's really interesting. I wonder if that isn't a theme for a lot of media made for sort of adolescents, particularly adolescent boys, like shonen jump
Right.
style animes where one is portrayed extremely immature, sort of, or rather maybe age, yeah, much individuals who are the appropriate level of maturity for their age, which is usually something like 15, 16, 17, with precocious slash preternatural abilities.
Yes. Yes.
So you find these people with these basically superpowers who are capable of great destruction. I mean, I think particularly of Fei Long at the very beginning of
Xenogears.
and what he does to his own city, his
Mhm.
own village. And then, but then they're confronted with the weight of the responsibility of bearing these superpowers, which often have terribly destructive effects. And this is something actually Final Fantasy 16 is like when you mentioned learning piece by piece about yourself, and you don't even have your right name when you start Final Fantasy 16. Yeah, it's very similar to Final Fantasy VII in that respect. He doesn't even know who he is, Cloud. Oh yeah, sorry, could you remind me what I was just saying? That tangent just totally took me off.
Sorry, so you were saying something about how in a lot of these games there's that theme of the young person with incredible abilities, and we
Right.
see them have this kind of, yeah, this struggle between the two things.
So thank you. So we find these 17-year-olds.
Right.
I think Squall is 17, Quistis is 18.
I think so, yeah, I think so.
But they are capable of summoning guardian forces. They fight with weapons, they against actual people in militaries. So they have the power of life and death in their hands. And
Yes.
like you said, is mentioned when they're fighting against these soldiers by some soldiers who exclaim, "These are just kids."
Mm-hmm.
And yet you are this scary sort of kid. You're SeeDs, actually, from Balam Garden. So there's a distinction between how they see just these young people, pardon me, versus these elite, scary soldiers. And so to some, so I wonder why or to what extent juxtaposing people who are just as mature as, say, we would have been at school age, but who have the additional burden and responsibility of great powers over life and death that they practically have to think about, because they are in fact seeing their friends die. And this will be a big issue for Squall later when he thinks Seifer dies. He's really going to think about how people talk about people after they die and how he doesn't want to be remembered in that same way, and that this seems to be actually for keeps. And of course, they are actually seemingly killing these soldiers that they're fighting against.
Yeah.
Pardon me. In ways that many teenagers, particularly in Western Europe and the United States at this particular time, don't have to confront. There are obviously child soldiers who exist throughout the world at this point. But right, I wonder if that makes for, that is the fiction that allows us to connect to these characters. Because if this were more of a realist portrayal, not Final Fantasy, one imagines that these characters would be a lot more hardened, or a lot meaner, or a lot deader in the eyes, that they would be callous soldiers. And I know it's the beginning of their careers, so perhaps they become that by the time they're 19 or 20. But we connect with them, or we did when we were younger, because we too were sort of soft and uncallous, and the world's eventualities and necessities had not beaten us down. We had much more hope about what we could accomplish and do, because, you know, who is to say that the world was the way that people claimed it was? And I think we were a lot more certain that it wasn't, or at least we were uncertain about what it was, whereas certain certainties start to impose themselves on one as one ages. But I wonder if that is sort of an unreal way of representing what a human could be, an idealized version of a young person who acts like a young, unaccomplished person, but is in fact elite in terms of accomplishment and ability. You know, even much more than just an Olympian, or even like a Navy SEAL, right? The fact that these people have unique weapons and guardian forces that are like gods that they can summon, and nobody else summons guardian forces against you in the entire game. So you are very, very unique. I think Ultimesha, the final enemy, is the only person that ever tries that sort of thing. And she junctions Griever and then herself. And Griever is a thought from your mind. So we're going to get pretty metaphysical, psychological at some point. But so it's almost like one of the greatest uses of this work, or this medium, and in this particular story, is not just showing or showcasing the Bildungsroman of the characters, but allowing for us through voyeurism ish to achieve a more powerful Bildungsroman, because we too are confronted with these questions about life and death, and the ethics of wielding this tremendous forces, and even realizing, and this is something we talked about with Final Fantasy VII, the weight of some of the choices we've made. This is something that struck me, because when I first played Final Fantasy VII as a 14-year-old, I was like, I'm obviously on the good side. And it wasn't until I played it again that I realized I was actually an eco-terrorist who was responsible for many innocent people's deaths, which is made even clearer in the remake, but is something that I could ignore in the original game. But in fact, you know, I was a character who was making decisions sort of callously that actually, when I thought about them, had a very big impact. And I think it's the same with Final Fantasy VIII. But to your point, they stay relatable, these characters, because it's like you and me as 15-year-olds playing a video game
Yeah.
that in this Ender's Game sort of way is in fact actually like the game of the world. It's like they can be untouched and untraumatized by their experiences in a way that we're untouched because we're playing a game, but the game for them is reality, but it doesn't strike them as deeply as one would expect.
Mhm, mhm. Well,
Yeah. So,
there's indications, throughout this sequence that there is some purpose to the garden beyond just being a mercenary force,
yes.
right? And that's also suggested by the actual thing that the invading army does there. They're not actually there to destroy the town, but are there to repair and get the communications tower working again. So there's sort of like this, again, this suggestion that like um we're kind of we're seeing only the surface right now when we're just going through these battles and things, that there's like underlying currents of some kind at work here. And we've heard, just a little bit so far about the idea of there being sorceresses. Um, as you point out, there's magical forces in the world, and we don't really know how they work. It's like kind of amusing how little we know about how they work. Um, but there's also this suggestion, right, that even SeeD, the headmaster, is not really in charge of what's going on there because people keep like cutting him off when he's about to say stuff to you. He's about to like kind of go into a little soapbox, and his uh, uh, like teacher person who kind of follows him around will just mention like, hey, sorry, you have a meeting soon, like we got to get, so they'll let you know that there's something else there. Um, and the way that that sort of plays out with the characters, again, being so oblivious, right? Just like seemingly um, not curious at all, right, about the wider world, how things work. They're just so excited to like pass their exam, and Selfie in particular is just like so into the garden, like this event that she's planning or whatever, right? The planning committee. And so that's like all she cares about. Zell is all about the hot dogs, like that's what he lives for. So it's just like, and um, and so again, there's like this very convincing way in which all these characters are just young and they're just kids for all their power. They use that power without fully understanding it, without understanding it even a little bit, right? Or the consequences of it, and that just feels so like spot on for like the kind of target audience of the game too, right? Um, and so I think it'll be pretty interesting to see some of that stuff getting revealed gradually here, um, getting to see the characters mature insofar as they do, but certainly getting to see the ways that the game is continually kind of messing with those expectations, those assumptions that we bring to it. Um, it,
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
it's really funny. Yeah.
In that way, I think it mimics one's actual life. One has
Yeah.
these sets of expectations set by one's family and one's schools, through one's basic society, that it's like grow, become seven,
Mm-hmm.
make
Mm-hmm.
it to the third grade. These are all pretty tangible and and so, but as one is going through school and such, one doesn't necessarily know that, say, one is part of a society that has a government that does things that might be defined as good, but also defined as evil, and depending on who is looking at the good or the actions, might be differently defined, right? Like so. So it might take one a long time to learn that the United States has this extrajudicial organization called the CIA, and then it might take one a long time to learn that the CIA does various things in various places, particularly in South America and Africa and East Asia, where it may stabilize or destabilize governments, and one might have particular views on that sort of thing. But in any case, that complicates one's view of the place from which one comes, which might have just been blithely considered good. It's like, well, I come from this place where, it schooled me. And maybe if one is very poor, it feeds you and maybe even offers you shelter. Maybe it's not the best thing, The projects are not generally considered the best places in the world, and yet those do represent efforts by one's larger society through the state of doing some good, though often it fails to do that. But there are also projects that same state engages in against enemy states or just differing states that it takes a lot of education to learn about, and then complicates one's perspective of like whether one is part of a good or a bad thing. In the same way that at a psychological level, as one sort of learns in this Jungian way that one is not the master of one's house, that in fact that there's a lot more going on in one, and that one is a mammal and has to deal with all of these forces and that come through in impulses, and that one's social role is sometimes even part of this. Like say you're a father like you are, and the sort of feeling you feel when your children disobey you is not necessarily a rational feeling, but is a powerful evolutionary feeling that you exert some rational control over, insofar as you're amazing, but is something that you must deal with, right? But so in the same way that you discover about yourself, you slowly learn about yourself after perhaps being very unreflective as a young person. One learns about the world in which one exists, and not just the world, but the kingdom in the Final Fantasy language, or the society that one comes from. And I think something Final Fantasy does extremely well is that it casts one's doubt on one's perception of oneself. The protagonists of the game, particularly Cloud and Squall, are good examples of this. It casts some doubt on whether one is part of a good organization, or has been. Cloud was part of Shinra, and then eco-terrorists as a mercenary. Are they the good guys? Are they doing good things? And then certainly casts doubt on one's perception of the world. Like, is Squall doing good things, being this mercenary for Balam Garden and killing these people in Dalit, and then just unquestionably taking these orders? And I think that is what mimics one's education in life, but also mimics or shows one the path for extraordinary self-reflection and growth, to be able to question one's society, one's sort of group affiliation, and oneself. Am I good in doing good things? Am I a part of the good guys who do the good things? And and is even my larger group, who are we in the world? This is something I think that we see in Final Fantasy IX, perhaps in 8, possibly also in 7, that wow, the kingdom I grew up in they're actually the bad guys.
Yep.
Some ways. I mean, especially 9. And 7, insofar as Shinra is the kingdom you grow up in, it's kind of stretching it. But that's something one has to realize. And even in 9, it's like my adopted mother is evil. This is something perhaps also in 16 you get as well. But because part of self-reflection is not just reflection on oneself, but the things that one is a part of, one's family and one's larger social group, whether it's kingdom, a nation, a state, whatever that is. I'd also say that I think these are extraordinarily difficult thoughts to have to entertain, but that is what is part of the greatness of Final Fantasy, that they show characters have to go through or choose to go through, because that's the only way to move forward, these sorts of moments. And that these moments are sort of like Abraham Maslow, like peak experience, like peak difficult things to do as a person, is to question one's own integrity and the integrity of the whole one is a part of. To some extent, I think this is what like Stranger Fiction said. This guy is just going through the motions through his whole life, not thinking about anything. But then once he starts thinking about things, he totally changes how he lives. And maybe that's part of the empowerment or the liberation of getting rid of a static image of oneself, insofar as you're willing to consider that your life could be better than it is, or you could be better than you are, or you're not good. That frees you up to have the dynamic energy to improve yourself and perhaps the world around you, which would be sort of a net good thing, right? You have to give up your naive image of you as good, but in so doing, you might actually do some good. And
so there,
yeah.
So there's, I mean, I think there's also a tendency to see these games as presenting good and evil in a really flat and simple way, right? Like a black and white kind of thing, um, because we lump them in with a lot of other fantasy, and that's sort of a cliche about the genre as a whole, right? But I think you're pointing out that it's not that way at all. And the way that this really shows up at the end of all of these games, you fight some sort of divine being, right?
Yes.
It's like you you have been going along throughout the game, understanding the complexity of good and evil in sort of like one field or one area, one level of reality, and then by the end of the game, you're ready to sort of like step beyond that level of reality and engage with something from a whole other plane of existence, right? And I think that is a pretty another just to like go along with what you're saying, like another clear way in which we're trying to um, get away from a simplistic binary of good and evil, where the hero is the good guy, the villain's the bad guy. Usually, the villain is not the final boss. So there's
Right.
some other kind of like system that you're a part of, um, that that you're in some way having to confront by the end of these games. Um,
Yeah, it's like
and
you find
yeah.
the embodiment of the idea and then the idea itself.
Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm.
right. Yeah. I mean, this particularly comes through in Final Fantasy 9 and 10 when it's like there is a clear final boss, Kuja and Jacked. But then there's this other boss that's an embodiment of like divine evil. That comes
Hmm.
out, that in Final Fantasy 10 literally causes this cycle that goes over and over and over. Uh,
Right, right, right.
and so, right, that'll be an interesting thing to talk about too, because Final Fantasy 16, again, you literally fight an enemy called Ultima last. And so that's I think it's been a very powerful conversation because that's totally right, because that's part of the smoke screen of the game, that it uses the generic conventions in order to deceive you into thinking that a simplistic narrative is before you, so that you, like the character, come in with simplistic, naive assumptions about the nature of the world that you're a part of and your own place in it as a player. And so when we perhaps when we get into some of the dream sequences, which I think we're coming up on the first one pretty soon with these Timberwolves
Hmm.
getting on the train, and seeing the voyeurism of Squall and Laguna, perhaps that is itself a representation of the video game player's complicity or with what happens within the space of the game. And that's something worth talking about too. In a game where one kills people, we're thinking about like say genres like the novel and Nabokov and reading Lolita,
Mm.
where like is it appropriate for one to have read that book? Is one if one reads the whole thing, is that in some way, and doesn't just throw it away in disgust? uh has one engaged in like in an inappropriate or grotesque act, and what is the difference between illicitly reading something that is fiction or versus engaging in something like that in reality, particularly keeping biblical maxims in mind, like the Decalogue, where it's like even to entertain the thought of one's friend's wife is to have committed infidelity. It's like, well, then it should seem like certain novels shouldn't be read. And
Right.
and yet I have read that novel. And so I'm not attacking anybody but myself in that way. But I think that's very powerful, what we've hit on in a Final Fantasy VIII of all games, too, that part of what these games do that is of profound value is prepare one to be able to question who one really is, and whether one is a part of is in fact what one thinks it is. With the caveat that it may very well be the opposite of what one thinks it is. And I think that's, if I were to put this in a sort of unintelligent way, I'd say that's very Shakespearean. But what I would mean to say is that that's very powerful, and that great authors like Shakespeare and Homer do these sorts of things, or confront their characters with such realizations as these, like Hamlet coming home, but home is no longer there, and home is no longer safe, home is not populated by good people, including his mother, who may very well not be good.
Yes.
And
Yes.
that's powerful. That's tough. That's tough stuff to deal with. Well, my friend, I think we're about at time. If there were any final thoughts that you wanted to share, or if you have any news or anything, I should direct people. Maybe you could tell people about your newsletter that you send out, and your blog that is very thoughtful and interesting. I really enjoy reading whenever it comes out. Seems like it comes out every couple weeks or once
Yeah.
or so. Yeah.
I've been trying to write more consistently, just mostly for my own discipline and to ever get to any of the things that I want to get to, I'll have to do that more. So I have been trying to do it weekly or every other week. It's Video Game Academy, or sorry, Video Game Academia, all one long word. And it's a WordPress. And so if you search that, you should be able to find it. It's also on Substack, same deal, Video Game Academia, Video Game Academy. And so I publish things there. I find that having the conversations is a really great way to like get ideas flowing. But then of course these are very loose and they're kind of all over the place. And so I do try to take certain things and put them into a more easy to digest format, and certainly a shorter one. So all the posts are relatively short, I think. I I generally am trying to connect video games and books in some kind of way. That's sort of like the thing. And so it'll be a book review or a reflection on a game or some kind of combination of games and books. And so um, I know that in game, yeah, we are about to have our first dream sequence, and I do remember this being kind of my favorite part of the game when I played it before. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how that stacks up this time around. Um, I guess if we play another little bit, we'll also get to like our first real mission, right? And so it's exciting to get to do something in the game after all of this, like essentially extended tutorial, right? That we've had so far.
Yeah.
So see how that
Fine.
goes.
Since we've already done all this work, let's hope that as the game actually gets rolling, that it's good and can get some momentum very fast.
Yes. Yes.
Well,
Yeah.
that another wonderful conversation with you, Wes. I'm looking forward to talking with you next week and hopefully being successful in our first missions. I'll have to ask you about which GFs you're using and how you're playing the game, whether you're summoning lots of GFs or whether you've just junctioned yourself extremely intelligently, and how you are at the R trigger with old Squall. All things to come. And all things that I know I used to be good at, but am not as good at
Yeah.
now. But that's just a preview of what maybe we'll say. All right. Well, wonderful to see you again, my friend, and thank you for joining me on another side quest.
Appreciate it.